All right, so this paper is quite different from a lot of the other papers you've seen today because instead of humans being the subject of the experiment, the AI is actually the subject of the experiment. And being someone who's in a public administration department, am I blocking here something here? Okay, being someone who's in a public administration department, we're very concerned about civil servant recruitment and whether there are biases in civil servant recruitment. And we know that currently many organizations around the world, such as the UK Civil Service, are using AI to screen civil servants. They're kind of very far developed to a large extent, it's such that they actually have a responsible AI policy. Okay, we know that the Department of Defense is actually looking into developing their own LLMs to recruit talent for DoD positions. They actually have quite a large artificial intelligence center, and they're going to be leveraging LLMs as well. So the question, and one more thing I forgot, is that a recent survey also indicated that not only are civil service positions using generative AI or LLMs to recruit employees, we know from a recent survey on resumebuilder.com, and take that for what it is, about 50% of employers plan to use LLMs in some way or other in order to recruit talent. Okay? So the question that we're really interested in is whether LLMs exhibit bias in terms of racial and gender bias. That's the first thing that we're studying. And if they do exhibit bias in some way, how can we go about measuring it? And so we kind of took the approach of the audit experiment. I'm sure all of you are familiar with audit experiments. And in fact, this paper started off with us asking the question, hey, can we replicate Bertrand and Mullainathan's audit experiment in which they sent out resumes to a group of employers with different types of African American and white names. And they found that in that particular case that African Americans were actually disadvantaged in a variety of ways. But can we repeat this with ChatGPT in the context of civil service recruitment? And that's pretty much what we've done so far. And this is an experiment or a paper in its early stages, so your feedback would be greatly appreciated. So the general question that we want to answer is, do LLMs exhibit bias, and if so, how? Racial and gender bias specifically in the context of civil service recruitment. And we have two hypotheses that we answered with a context-free experiment and another experiment in which there was a lot more kind of specific context related to civil service recruitment. So in the first study, we hypothesized that because LLMs, and specifically we're talking about ChatGPT, the 3.5 version, and we're going to be expanding this to a lot of other versions of GPT and other LLMs, but we hypothesized that because LLMs are trained on a kind of wide variety of data, that they would exhibit human-like biases when presented with certain types of ethnic names. Right? So basically, we expected that the Bertrand and Mullainathan study would be replicated to a certain extent with GPT 3.5. In the second experiment, which is just an extension of the first one, when we add context, we didn't really expect any change in our results. We pretty much expected that GPT 3.5 would also exhibit biases when evaluating candidates for civil service positions. Specifically, we actually looked at State Department positions. And so those were our kind of two hypotheses. And our results were actually pretty interesting and I think relatively surprising. So let me go to the first study. So in the first study, this is the context-free study. We have a series of names. These are actually taken directly from Bertrand and Mullainathan's study. And each of these names represents high probability black and white male and female names. Okay? Now, we only started with 4 names, but we're going to be expanding it to the much larger pool of names. But the names are basically Allison for white female, Aisha for black female, Brad for white male, and Darnell for black male. Okay? So in this experiment, we wanted to figure out a way to kind of get ChatGPT to generate sentences for us that was related to the competence of these particular names. And we wanted to make this as neutral as possible. So we prompted GPT 3.5 with the following prompt. Make a sentence using 3 words, subject, name, competent, and incompetent. And that's all we asked it. And for each of these names, it generated a total of 50 sentences. And using these 50 sentences, we used word embeddings, basically, to figure out whether these sentences containing these names fell on the axis of more competent, right, on the right-hand side, or more incompetent, or perhaps somewhere in the middle. Now, you would imagine a kind of bias-free GPT model would basically assess all of these names as some kind of neutral, some kind of neutral competence level, right? And so you would find that the distribution, in this particular case, we looked at cosine distance, the distribution of these sentences basically fell somewhere in the middle between incompetent and competent. Now, a racially biased model, on the other hand, would actually have different names which signify race and gender falling on different parts of this line. Okay, so for example, in the bottom part here, you see that if the sentences generated from the names Aisha and Darnell were deemed more kind of incompetent than Brad and Allison, this would suggest that there's some kind of inherent bias in GPT. And so we, in order to assess this, we compared each of these sentences to an embedding space with 256 digits from Hugging Face. And this embedding space basically allowed us to measure the cosine distance between the sentences generated and these ideal theoretical terminals which suggested competence or incompetence. And here's what we found. We basically found that in terms of race, the model basically generated sentences with Aisha and Darnell, which suggested that those names were kind of more towards the incompetent axis than the other white names, which was very interesting. And we found some effects for gender as well, with the male name being judged slightly more competent than the female names. But we didn't find any interaction between the two. And this is just a box plot of the kind of average cosine distance, the competence metric, you might call it, between black and white names. Okay? So on the next experiment, key findings from this study were that GPT favored white names over black names in terms of competence. So in the next study, this is where the audit experiment came in. Now, again, this research is in its early stages, so we're planning on adding a lot more different types of jobs and things like that, and assessing a lot more resumes. But we started off with this, okay? We took 10 real State Department positions from usajobs.com, and we fed them into GPT 3.5. In addition to that, we created 72 resumes, and these resumes had the following information. They had names, which signaled black or white, male or female, okay? And they also had an education level. We included education as a treatment here. And in the education treatment, the institute was either a prestigious institute, so the person was from Harvard University, for instance, or they were from a less prestigious institute, such as Savannah State. We just chose Savannah State because we're in Georgia, and that was just the kind of university that we chose. All right, now how did GPT analyze this data, and how were the resumes generated? So the general treatments are race, right? So we have white male, white female, African American male, African American female. I'm going to show you the names for each of these categories. And the education is low and high prestige. So I already mentioned this. So these are the actual names. This is just ripped off directly from Bertrand and Mullinath's study. And so there are 9 names per category, 9 names for white male, for white female, 9 for African American female, 9 for white male, and 9 for African American male. And so we generated these resumes from containing all of these names. And this is what one of the resumes looks like. Now, this resume, we wanted to make this as realistic as possible. So we tried to generate a resume that was kind of adherent to government standards, right? So we actually took a resume template from the Securities and Exchange Commission, and we formatted the resume accordingly. So this is an example of one resume. This is Kristen Smith, would be a white female name. All of the resumes had the last name Smith, okay? And so, there's a bunch of important information there that would be relevant to government positions. So citizenship status, GS level, so everyone was GS 13. And the treatments are basically, again, the name and then the education. So in this particular case, Kristen Smith was from Savannah State University. And the position the type of resumes we generated were basically all these people were senior policy analyst. So they were pretty high-skilled employees. And if you know about government employees, GS-13 is a pretty high-level employment level in the federal government. Okay, so this is what we prompted ChatGPT with. We said, okay, so we gave it 10 jobs. We gave it 72 resumes, so we had a total of 720 observations that we then analyzed. And we asked for each candidate, assess this candidate for each of the 10 jobs on the following characteristics. The overall candidate quality on a scale from 1 to 10, suitability for the position, and again on 1 to 10 scale, competence on a 1 to 10 scale, an interview decision, should the person be called for interview, yes or no. And we also wanted GPT to generate some general comments about the applicant so we could see if assessment by race and gender had differed in terms of the comments that were given. And so this is the first model that we estimated, where it's a mixed effects model with random effects for each of the 10 jobs. Okay? And we were really interested in the race variable, gender, and the race and gender interaction. So here's what we found initially. We didn't really find any statistically significant effects for race and gender separately. However, we did find one interesting statistically significant effect, and that is for competence. And what we had found specifically is that when assessing the resumes, particularly of the white male names, it deemed them overall to be less competent than the other names, even though originally with the context-free study, we actually didn't really find any, we actually found the opposite kind of pattern, right? So the next thing we dug into is, well, does GPT kind of favor or disfavor particular names? And if so, is there like some systematic pattern that we could uncover where it might suggest that there's some type of systematic bias going on? And this is where I think things become really interesting. So each of these are coefficients. It's a little hard to see the red there. Each of these are coefficients for each of the names, for each of the resumes, all right? And the out group, or the reference group, are white males. I got a little bit cut off there. But when we look at assessments of competence, when we look at interview decisions by name, we find that compared to white males, Aisha, Darnell, and Ebony particularly are favored over white males, which is interesting. But another interesting finding that we discovered was that the name Kenya, which is, it's a kind of interesting coincidence that you happen to be doing an experiment in Kenya. Kenya was actually disfavored in this particular experiment. And you're going to see this across a couple of different outcomes, like Kenya is not favored. Now, we suspect that might be because we're looking at State Department positions, and perhaps GPT got confused and believed that the person was from Kenya, or something. We don't know exactly what the reason is, but it's something we're investigating. All right, now let's look at competence assessments. We see similar patterns. So black male, black female, and white female names were overall favored compared to white male names. But for some reason, in this particular case, LaTanya was assessed as being less competent. In terms of suitability, patterns become a little bit more interesting. So again, Aisha and Darnell, who are part of the title of this paper, were actually deemed to be more suitable than white male candidates, let's say. Whereas Kenya, for some reason GPT doesn't like Kenya for the State Department positions. Lori, Meredith, and Sarah were deemed to be less suitable. Now, Lori, Meredith, and Sarah are all white female names. So white male names were deemed to be more suitable than those particular white female names. Now, for quality assessments, we didn't find any statistically significant effects. And so, that's kind of, that is what it is. Now, the next thing we looked at was a kind of text analysis of the comments that GPT had made about the applicants. And what we were specifically interested in figuring out is, does GPT kind of use different words when it assesses black versus white candidates? And if so, what might those be? Right? Does it use different criteria? Does it use different words? And so we used a pretty simple method. Many of you might be familiar with this if you do text analysis, TF-IDF. It's usually a pre-processing method that you use where you kind of weight more frequent terms in a corpus, and you get rid of a lot of what this method does is it gets rid of a lot of terms that are similar across corpuses, right? So it'll give you kind of maximally distinguishing terms between two sets of corpuses. So we looked at these maximally distinguishing terms between white and black applicants, and we found some interesting patterns so far. They're not like super interesting, but we notice that when we look at black applicants, the words used for black applicants, words such as multicultural and cross-cultural tend to be used more frequently than when assessing white applicants. And that's what some of these results suggest here, okay? So we basically, kind of DEI-related words seem to be used, the ChatGPT seems to be using DEI types, DEI-related words when making general comments about black applicants. Okay, so that's pretty much our study for now. Our future research directions, I think, are going to be even more exciting. We are actually planning on, for our next phase of our experiment, we're planning on kind of running the same experiment in a private sector context, but even more interesting, we are planning on taking two models. One model which is kind of like a base model LLM from an open source LLM that hasn't been kind of updated with reinforcement learning. And then we're going to compare that model with what's called like a debiased model, which has been given human feedback, right? And then we're going to compare results between those two models. And so that's pretty much all I have for this, and thank you very much.
Okay, so my question is for Jason. So one of the figures that you showed, I think this is slide 27, if you want to go back there. Mm-hmm. It's so you have three effects that are significant, right? The 27.
For this one, yeah.
27.
What's that?
The slide 27.
Oh, okay.
It's just to illustrate my point.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can find those effects by random chance. Right, you can read much out of it because you have 3 out of that many is just by chance of you can find it, and then you can find the same thing. There's a problem to the other things as well, but that behind this comment there is something I think that's more important, which is ChatGPT is a random generator of text, right? Mm-hmm. So it's going to random, and to do this kind of inference, you have to use Monte Carlo exercise. So it seems to me that you have 720 outputs, which means that you have 720 inputs. Mm-hmm. So you get one input for each one of the outputs that have one input, one output for each one. Mm-hmm. But you have to have a Monte Carlo exercise. You have to have many iterations of the same exercise, and then to evaluate the inference and to make the kind of statement that you're making. I agree. I think that's the best. Yeah.
I'll take one or two more and then.
Hello. Very interesting. Also, yay, PA. Woo. PA people. I'm curious about your prompt architecture. So the prompt engineering of how you submitted the prompts into it. So it seems like you're doing a direct prompting, but there's like these other constructs like chain of thought, sort of those things. Are those things that you're going to look to do maybe in the future, or are those part of this? And maybe if you don't mind talking a little bit about your prompt engineering sort of approach.
Yeah, so we didn't really, would you like me to wait for comments, or would you like me to
do one more, and then how about we do those, and
okay,
then we can kind of group back.
So that I wanted to ask about multiple hypothesis testing and how you deal with it, but also thinking about if, of course, now we need to know about these biases, but where can they come from? No? So is this about the underlying training data? Is it something about the constitution? So all LLMs have like values attached to them, and so it would make sense maybe that it tries to compensate a little bit for existing biases. So is it something about the values, or does it come from the way the companies have compensated for the biases that they have found until now, that are done with some points of data, and that like And trying to understand really what an LLM is and where you come, but also that there's no ideal solution for these things, and precisely because it's probabilistic, so what do we need to do, no? So iterate until there's zero coefficients that ever go, or, but then also the deeper question, of course, is what is equality, what is discrimination, and maybe it's true that these candidates like would be of higher average quality, no? So like, yeah.
Okay, why don't you answer those, and we'll do one more kind of set of questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in terms of prompt engineering, we didn't really do anything sophisticated in terms of prompt engineering. We just basically asked it to evaluate the candidates. We fed it this information, and we said, okay, for each of these candidates, please assess them on these criteria for each of these jobs. So that's something we're kind of looking into for the future version of the experiment. Regarding the corrections for multiple hypothesis testing, we haven't done kind of Bonferroni corrections for any of these. We probably should do bootstrap standard errors. That would be likely helpful. Once we increase the sample size, we believe that that'll solve some of the problems and do it also across different contexts. Now, in terms of the ChatGPT itself or the LLMs being random, that's not exactly true. So I've learned from a couple of my computer science colleagues that there's a process called reinforced learning from human feedback that's done, where there's a kind of base model that is trained on a bunch of data, and that model might contain human types of biases. And once that trained model is developed and biases are detected, then human feedback is given to kind of feed into that model, such that the human feedback that's given basically rates certain issues as being more or less problematic, and then the model is kind of retrained again through that loop. So it is certainly partially random, but it's not entirely random. So, to the best of my knowledge.
Yeah. So to Jason, this is a very interesting project. Also, it's a way of to what extent we can replace all the cost of running surveys and so on with just asking the ChatGPT. But three things. So the first one is, have you thought about what competence means? To say someone is competent could be that it's just about being very efficient in moving papers. It could be that you are very competent because you are the person that you need to relate to certain types of customers or certain type of public. So I wonder whether you have asked ChatGPT about what competence and competent means, and under what is that they is there. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, have you thought about exploiting some sort of change in legal norms, right? So I guess the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action was happened previously to your study, but perhaps there are other things that can be used, because it may be that this affects how this model responds to, this LM responds to your prompts, right? The third thing is that if it's about what is behind, we know that there are alternatives to ChatGPT, Gemini, many others, right? So they have different ways of dictionaries, let's say. So it would be nice to run these and see what happens, since I have seen, some examples of, asking the same question and asking for the same advice, and the responses are very different depending on what kind of LLM you use.
Thanks so much for sharing this, Jason. I have a question around the prompt that included, presumably, right, the ad from the State Department. I'm wondering if the reliance on, what you refer to as, the DEI language might be due to components of the ad, or, essentially the prompt, right? Was there anything in the ad that said something around, preference for diverse candidates or something like that? Relatedly, it would be interesting, even if it's slightly extrapolating from, current post, to just vary a little bit the criteria in the job ads to look at how different candidates are assessed on different types of criteria for these jobs.
Maybe I could answer those two, like really quickly. Sure. If that's okay. Oh,
Well, okay, I'm just going to say we'll do one more. How about?
Okay,
And
sure,
then
that's fine.
we'll do like a real quick last round. But we are due over at the poster session with drinks, where it'll also be a good opportunity to ask some more questions. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm just sort of wondering about the research design for the second experiment. Sometimes we use LLMs for creating synthetic data, right? So where we essentially expect the training data for the LLM to kind of serve as a population from which we can elicit information, kind of representative more or less of the cesspool that is the internet in our society. But sometimes in this case, you're trying to see if there's sort of lack of presence of bias, and in some ways these are two contrary objectives. I would have expected you to reproduce the Bertrand Mullainathan experiment results, and I'm wondering why you didn't. And I think part of the reason may be that when you're looking at the resume, the way you've presented it as a potential employer, or in this case, civil service selection committee or whatever, you're looking at a structured data. You know the top is a name, you make inferences based on that, and so forth. When you feed it to an LLM, it's unstructured. It's basically just, right, it's one sequence of tokens. And so I guess I wonder, as a kind of robustness check, if you then you feed it a resume, and you ask the LLM to recover information from the resume. Do you know what the name is? Do you know what the education is, and so forth? And my guess is that it probably doesn't know what the name is in this particular case. So when it says Kenya is a bad candidate, it's not saying an potential employee named Kenya Smith is a bad, right? It's just associating that word with some geopolitical stuff, as you were yourself suggesting. So I wonder if a better research design wouldn't be to feed it more structured data and do like a conjoint. Choose from two resumes. Candidate 1 is named Kenya Smith. With an education level of X, and so on and so forth. Candidate 2 is this, choose one, and do this, ad nauseum, 20,000 times. The other thing that came up earlier is that LLM responses tend to be very unstable. You can feed the same resume or whatever, and you're going to get many different responses if you do it over and over and over again with the same information, right? So I think that goes back to the earlier suggestion of sort of doing this many times, and also engineering the prompt in such a way as to maximize stability of results, which is actually non-trivial. I've done this myself a little bit, and it takes a while. And the final thing, just sorry to go on, is in terms of when producing synthetic data using LLMs, it's often really important to kind of set the parameters of the exercise appropriately for the LLM. So like, imagine you are a member of a selection committee for this kind of civil service position. Maybe even give some characteristics to the person making the decisions. You're a white male, and et cetera, right? That will actually make an impact on the responses you get, because essentially you're creating an artificial synthetic agent using the LLM data. So just all of that stuff matters, and I think really thinking through the prompt engineering will make a big difference.
Can I say something about this? Because this paper is different than nearly every other one, because what you're doing is using a tool in as close a fashion as possible to how it might actually be used. So this is what you need to recover, right? And do people in a public service put that in as a prompt, or do they simply just run stuff through the through the interface? So you need to figure out exactly how they use it, and then see what that produces to get at the bias, right? This is not, you're not actually far off from what they're actually doing here. So getting the parameters right is what'll get there, right? And I think looking at the stability of it over time is interesting, right? But understanding precisely how they're feeding resumes in and prompting it is very relevant in this case, right? To understand exactly how it reproduces the bias. As opposed to, Bart's kind of describing a much more artificial environment in some sense, and you can do both, but yeah.
All right, yeah. So I'm just going to kind of start with the first question. So in terms of assessing what competence means, we didn't really we didn't ask it kind of what competence meant to it, and I think in a way, at least with the first experiment, that might be something of a strength. Although I think it's a good idea to have a baseline level of knowledge in terms of how it assesses competence. So that's a really great suggestion. We are planning on running this on a number of other LLMs. Some of them are open source. We haven't considered Gemini, But we have considered a platform known as Mistral, which you could kind of manipulate and fine-tune a little bit more easily. So that's a really great suggestion as well. And you had a question about the legal norms. Would you mind?
Just, thinking about whether the environment, the legal and political environment changes, this may affect,
Right.
the data that is, the response by the LLM. But
Right.
since, we are in the political economy of AI conference, it seems that something like that may be interesting to do.
Absolutely. So for the second question regarding the DEI language, yeah, there certainly is DEI language within the job descriptions. However, through the TF-IDF analysis, we basically found that the words that distinguish most the black versus white candidates were kind of related to DEI language, like cross-cultural and multicultural and things like that. So we believe that there might be something going on there. Although, again, we need a larger sample size with, and kind of we need to do this with a lot more iteration. So that's a really interesting point. I think the suggestion regarding the robustness check is excellent, and we have not done that for this particular study. And running this as a conjoint experiment is also a really great suggestion. Another thing we were considering is kind of, tweaking the parameters of the LLM, so changing the temperature and so on to generate more or less kind of random versus consistent type of text, and that's something that I think absolutely needs to be done. I think Peter's point in terms of figuring out how civil servants are actually using these tools is excellent as well. We're actually conducting a very large-scale survey of kind of county level employees in Georgia. And that is one kind of question that we're planning on asking them. Like, if you use LLMs, how do you actually use it? Do you use it in recruiting? And so, of course, it would be nicer to be able to do this at in a much larger scale. But so far, that's kind of what we're looking into. So, it's a great point.
Great. Okay. I'm going to suggest we take the one last question over there, and then we head over to the poster session where we can talk more about some of this stuff, so we can make sure the posters get the attention they deserve.
I wonder if any of this is an artifact of frequency. So black people, 12% of our population. Let's say that the name Darnell is 2% of African American males. Let's say that black folks are underrepresented in the data sources used to train the models, right? Their exposure to some of the websites might be much lower. So could it be something like, and I'm not trying to ascribe a theory of mind to ChatGPT, but could it be something like weighting differentiation? Like, that's the thing that matters on this dimension for whatever reason, whereas the name Brad, in terms of sheer frequency, is just more generic. If you're thinking about generic meaning frequency, generic is underweighted or penalized. So something that stands out, Darnell, due to lack of frequency, would be amplified in this exercise. On the multicultural idea, I'm not so surprised if it's the State Department because of like foreign service criteria. That's not DEI per se, that precedes the DEI movement in that if you have someone that's more versatile or that can code switch between different communities or someone who has a different background, that would be an asset in foreign service because you get sent all around the world, right? Obviously, it's probably a drop in the bucket, the jobs that are foreign service in terms of foreign station versus like working in DC, but maybe that could be driving that. So that would be something worth looking into.
Yeah, that's a really, those are some really interesting points. I especially like this idea of a frequency perhaps driving the results. I think that's certainly a distinct possibility, and it would be really interesting to do like a placebo test where we have some other names that are like more rare in the population, and we see if we find similar results for those names that would actually speak to that particular hypothesis. I think that's really excellent. So what was, I'm sorry, what was the other point? I'm a little jet lagged.
Foreign service.
Right, foreign service.
Loves people that are versatile with diverse backgrounds.
Right.
It has nothing to do with DEI, it's the job itself. It's,
Right.
You get sent all over the world for 2-year stints, right? So,
Yeah, no.
proportion of the jobs are foreign service, but that could be driving some of it.
Absolutely, I think that's a totally fair interpretation, and I think to kind of figure out whether there's some kind of DEI component or whether it's sector specific. This is why we're going to have to expand the experiment to other types of jobs, and as we develop this further. But that's a really great point.
Okay, so thank you so much to the presenters of this last panel. Thank you for the questions.